The morning my brother stood up in that conference room and called me a failure, I didn't say a word. I just looked at him. Then I looked at my father's attorney, a sharp-suited man named Gerald Finch, who had driven 3 hours from Cincinnati to be there, and I watched his jaw tighten, not because of what my brother said, because of what he knew that my brother didn't. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Daniel. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working for the federal government in a job I rarely talked about at family dinners, and for most of my adult life, my family assumed I was some kind of mid-level bureaucrat who shuffled papers in a beige office somewhere outside of Columbus. My brother, I'll call him Ray, told his wife I worked in accounting for the feds. My sister-in-law once introduced me at a Christmas party as the boring one. I never corrected them. My father knew the truth. He always had. But my father was a quiet man, too, and he understood, the way only certain men do, that not every truth needs to be announced. My father's name was William. He built his money slowly, the way men of his generation did, through decades of work, careful savings, a small commercial property in Dayton that appreciated far beyond what anyone expected, and a discipline with money that bordered on the obsessive. He drove the same truck for 19 years. He resold his shoes. He clipped coupons until the day he turned 80. By the time his health began to fail, the estate his attorney had helped him structure was worth just over $2 million. Ray knew about the money. Ray had always known about the money. What Ray didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my father had spent the last 11 years quietly ensuring that Ray would never touch a dollar of it without my signature. I found out my father had dementia on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 3 years ago. My father's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Elaine Burroughs, called me directly. Not Ray. Me. She had my number because my father had given it to her specifically for situations like this one. She told me she had found him in the backyard at 2 in the morning, wearing his winter coat over his pajamas, convinced he needed to get to a hardware store that had closed in 1987. I drove to Dayton that night. Ray, who lived 40 minutes from my father, had not visited in 6 weeks. I didn't call Ray that night. I called my father's primary care physician. I called Gerald Finch, and then I sat in my father's kitchen under the yellow light above the stove that he'd never gotten around to replacing with something brighter, and I drank his coffee from his chipped Ohio State mug, and I made a list of everything that needed to happen. Over the next 8 months, I drove to Dayton 41 times. I know because I kept a log, not because I was planning anything, but because that's what I do. I note things. Dates, times, conversations. I have done it my whole career. It's not strategy so much as instinct. I arranged my father's memory care evaluation. I found him a specialist in Columbus. I coordinated with Gerald Finch to ensure the durable power of attorney was properly established while my father still had enough clarity to execute it legally and voluntarily. I sat with my father for 4 hours on a Wednesday in September, while Gerald walked him through every page. My father understood what he was signing. He even made a small joke about it, said he'd rather give control to someone who knew what they were doing than someone who would buy a boat with it. He looked at me when he said that. Gerald witnessed the document. A second attorney was present as required. Everything was done exactly right. I did not tell Ray. This was not cruelty. This was history. I'd watched Ray borrow $8,000 from my father in 2019, promised to repay it by spring, and never mention it again. I'd watched Ray's wife, a woman named Connie who wore a lot of perfume and talked about real estate constantly, corner my father at Thanksgiving 2 years before his diagnosis and ask him directly whether he had thought about what would happen to the house. I had watched my father change the subject and then find me in the kitchen afterward and say quietly, "That woman makes me nervous, Daniel." I remembered that. When my father's condition progressed to the point where he needed full-time memory care, I found him a facility 40 minutes from my house. It was expensive, and it was excellent. I visited twice a week. I brought him the same things every time: black coffee in a thermos, a newspaper he could no longer fully read but liked to hold, and a photograph of him and my mother from 1974 that he sometimes recognized and sometimes didn't. Ray visited 4 times in 14 months. Each time he called me afterward to discuss the cost of the facility. The calls had a pattern. He would ask how my father was doing. I would tell him, then he would mention that a lot of his money is going into that place, and wonder aloud whether there were more affordable options. I would tell him the care was appropriate for his needs. Ray would go quiet. Then he would say something like, "I just want to make sure we're being smart about this." We. As if he had been part of any of it. I said very little during these calls. I listened. I noted the dates. My father passed away on a Thursday morning in February, 14 months after he entered memory care. I was with him. I had arrived the night before, because one of the nurses called me and said his breathing had changed. I sat in the chair beside his bed all night. At some point around 4 in the morning, he opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression that seemed entirely clear, entirely present, like a window briefly uncovered, and he said my name, just my name. But the way he said it meant something. It meant, "I know you were here. I always knew you were here." He passed 3 hours later just as the light outside his window was turning from gray to pale yellow. I called Ray at 7 that morning. Ray's first question, after a pause that lasted just a beat too long, was, "Did he have any paperwork with him? Anything in his room?" I told him I would be in touch. Gerald Finch had already been notified. The estate process began the following week. Gerald sent formal notification to all relevant parties. Ray retained his own attorney, a man from Dayton named Marcus Webb, who specialized in the state litigation and had a website that used the phrase "fighting for your rightful inheritance" in the header. I noted that too. The formal meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Gerald's office in Cincinnati. Ray and Connie arrived together. Connie wore a blazer I had never seen before. Ray had gotten the haircut. They sat on one side of the long conference table. I sat on the other, alone. Gerald sat at the head. Marcus Webb sat beside Ray with a legal pad already covered in notes. We hadn't even started when Ray looked across the table at me and said, "I hope you're not going to make this difficult." I said nothing. Gerald opened the meeting. He began explaining the structure of the estate, the will, the trust, the power of attorney, the distribution schedule. Marcus Webb interrupted twice in the first 4 minutes. The second time, he said that his client had concerns about the circumstances under which certain documents were executed, and whether my father had been in a position to make informed decisions. Ray looked at me when Webb said this. His expression was something between accusatory and satisfied, like a man who has been waiting a long time to say something and is finally saying it. Then he said it himself. "Dad didn't understand what he was signing, Daniel. You know that. He was already confused. You took advantage of him." I looked at my father's attorney. Gerald had his hands folded on the table. His expression gave nothing away. I looked back at Ray. "You drove him to appointments," Ray continued, his voice getting louder now, easier, the way voices do when someone has rehearsed. "You kept the rest of us away from him. You made decisions without consulting anyone. You managed everything so that you'd end up with control and the rest of us got nothing. Dad was confused and you used that. That's what happened." Connie was nodding. Marcus Webb wrote something on his legal pad. Ray leaned forward. "You were never there for this family, Daniel. You were always gone, always somewhere else, always too important to pick up the phone. And now you show up and want to control everything. You want to act like you were the devoted son. You did nothing for this family. You did nothing for Dad." The room was very quiet. I did not respond. I have sat in rooms where people were trying to make me react for 31 years. I have learned that silence is not absence. Silence is presence, controlled. Silence is the discipline of knowing that the moment you speak out of anger, you give the other person exactly what they came for. I sat with my hands on the table, and I looked at my brother, and I let him finish. When he was done, Gerald Finch set down his pen. He looked at Marcus Webb. He said calmly and without any particular emphasis, Mr. Webb, are you aware of the nature of your client's brother's professional background? Webb glanced at Ray. I don't see how that's relevant. Gerald said, it may be relevant to several of the claims your client just made. Webb frowned. What do you mean? Gerald opened the folder in front of him. He slid a single page across the table toward Webb. It was a document I recognized, one of several Gerald had prepared at my father's specific direction nearly 11 years ago. Webb read it. His expression shifted, not dramatically. Attorneys are trained against that. But his shoulders changed. Ray was watching him. What is it? What does it say? Webb set the page down. He looked at me for the first time since the meeting had started. There was something in his look that wasn't hostility anymore. It was reassessment. Gerald said, perhaps before we proceed, it would be useful for everyone to have a clearer picture of the situation. He looked at me. I nodded. Gerald then explained, carefully, procedurally, in the measured language of a man who has managed other people's most difficult moments for 40 years, that I had retired 2 years prior from a senior investigative role with the Inspector General's office of a major federal agency, that I had spent the majority of my career investigating financial fraud, asset concealment, and the exploitation of vulnerable adults, that my father had known this, that my father had in fact specifically designated me as executor and sole trustee of his estate, not despite my absence from Dayton, but because of my professional background and because he trusted my judgment absolutely. He then explained that the power of attorney had been executed during a window that 3 separate physicians had documented in writing as a period of sufficient cognitive capacity. That my father had been evaluated by a geriatric psychiatrist 6 days before signing, that the evaluation was on file, that my father had answered every orientation question correctly that day, had discussed the document in detail with Gerald and the second witness attorney, and had made the small joke about the boat. Gerald had written it down at the time. It was in his notes. Ray's face had gone very still. Webb was writing quickly now, but differently than before. Not the confident shorthand of a man building a case, but the tighter, more careful notation of someone recalculating. Gerald continued. He noted that over the 14 months of my father's residence at the memory care facility, I had visited 119 times. He had the facility logs. He had obtained them because he anticipated this meeting. He noted that during that same period, my brother had visited 4 times. He noted that 2 of those visits had occurred in the week after my father's formal estate notification was sent, that is, after Ray learned the full value of what was at stake. Connie looked at the table. Ray said, That's not the point. Gerald said, What is the point, mister? Ray? Ray didn't answer. Webb leaned over and said something quietly to Ray. Ray shook his head once, sharply, the gesture of a man who came in ready for a fight and is now realizing the fight was over before it started. There was a long silence. I thought about my father's kitchen, the yellow light, the chipped mug, the 41 drives to Dayton. I thought about 4 in the morning and the window uncovering for just a moment and my name said in the dark. I thought about Thanksgiving years ago, my father finding me in the kitchen after Connie had cornered him, saying quietly, That woman makes me nervous, Daniel. I thought, he knew. He knew who was paying attention. I didn't say any of this out loud. Webb requested a recess. Gerald granted 15 minutes. Ray and Connie went into the hallway. I stayed at the table and drank the coffee Gerald's assistant had set out and looked at the photographs on Gerald's wall. A law school graduation, a fishing trip, a grandchild on someone's shoulders at what looked like a state fair. When they came back, Ray didn't look at me right away. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. Then he looked up. I don't know what I expected. An apology, maybe. Or more anger. Sometimes people double down when they're cornered. Sometimes they get louder, as if volume can substitute for the argument they've run out of. Ray just looked tired. He said, I didn't know. I said, I know you didn't. He said, about any of it, what you did, I didn't know. I said, Dad knew. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he never told me. I said, "No, he didn't." I think about that exchange sometimes. There was more pain in it than in anything else that happened that day, more than the accusations, more than the document being slid across the table, more than Webb's expression shifting. My brother had spent years building a version of me in his head, the absent one, the distant one, the one who cared about his career more than his family, and that version had made certain things easier for him. It had made the calls about more affordable options easier. It had made the 4 visits easier to justify. It had made standing up in that conference room and saying you did nothing for this family possible, and none of it had been true. But he had believed it, and I had let him believe it because I was not in the habit of explaining myself, and because I had trusted that the truth would surface when it needed to. It had. The estate proceeded according to my father's wishes. The trust distribution was handled exactly as documented. Ray received the portion my father had designated for him. A fair portion, a considered portion, the portion of a man who loved his son but knew his son's limitations. There was no litigation. Webb withdrew the challenge. I drove home that evening through the flat Ohio landscape, the fields bare in February, the sky that particular shade of gray that sits just above the horizon and holds the last light a little longer than you expect. I had a thermos of coffee in the cuff holder that I hadn't touched. The radio was off. I thought about what my father had said to me once, years ago, when I was young and had come home frustrated about something at work, some situation where I had done the right thing and it had not been recognized, and I was complaining about it the way young men do. My father had listened. He'd let me finish. Then he said, "Daniel, the work is its own record. You just have to make sure someone's keeping it." I had kept it. Every visit logged, every call noted, every document witnessed and filed and preserved, not for that conference room, not for the moment Webb's expression shifted, not to win anything, for my father. Because he asked me to, because he trusted me to, because he said my name at 4 a.m. with everything he had left, and I was there to hear it. That was enough. A few weeks after the estate settled, I received a letter, handwritten, on plain paper in Ray's handwriting, less neat than it used to be, the handwriting of a man getting older. He said he was sorry, not for the legal challenge, though he mentioned that too, but for what he had said in that room. "For you did nothing for this family." He said he'd been talking to his daughter, who had apparently known more about my visits to our father than Ray had realized. She had told him some things. He didn't specify what things. He said, "I built a story about you that was wrong. I'm sorry I believed it. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and put it in the same file where I keep the visit logs and the physician's documentation and Gerald's notes about the bojo. Some records you keep because they're required. Some you keep because they're true. And some you keep because someday you might want to remember that things resolved the way they were supposed to, that the truth, even when it takes years, even when nobody announces it, even when it has to be carried quietly through 41 drives in the dark, the truth does surface. My father knew that. He just made sure I was the one keeping the record.